Pop culture used to go through a lot of changes within the span of a decade. We talk about pop culture in terms of decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, but these decades weren't all just one thing. The early years of a decade could be extremely different from the end of one. And when it came to the 90s, even as a kid, I could see different mutations happening every few years. My favorite little epoch was at the beginning, the turning of the 80s into the 90s. I think at the start of every new decade, there's a sense of adventurousness in the culture, of wanting to make bold new statements. This didn't happen in the early years of the 2020s, for obvious reasons, but in the late 1980s especially, with the Cold War ending and the new millennium approaching, it was an exciting and uncertain time in America, and the pop culture reflected the sense that now anything could be possible. I think for young people who were coming of age at that time and trying to differentiate themselves from what had come before, they basically looked back on the 1980s as a culturally conservative time, and they wanted to move beyond that. They wanted to push the culture in weirder directions, and for a short time, it actually manifested itself in the mainstream. Batman was redefined for a generation by a goth art student. Silence of the Lambs won the Oscar for Best Picture. David Lynch brought his surrealism into America's living rooms with Twin Peaks. Mainstream pop music was opening up to the likes of Nine Inch Nails, R.E.M., and The Cure. I find this period of pop culture fascinating because it was really the beginning of Gen X culture, but early Gen X culture was actually free of self-awareness because Generation X didn't have a name yet. That term was popularized by Douglas Copeland's novel Generation X, which was published in March of 1991, but even then it's not like everyone in America started using that term overnight. Once a cultural movement or moment in time has a label, it loses a lot of its vitality because self-awareness makes artistic experimentation harder. People begin to make more self-consciously calculated choices around other people's expectations. And especially on the corporate mass marketing level, when there's real money to be made, by that time it really gets homogenized and diluted into a parody of itself. This is all to say that I think the late 1980s and early 90s were Gen X's most creatively fertile period, before every little subculture within it was being prepackaged at the mall, from grunge to goth to rave to cyberpunk. And much like their baby boomer parents, Gen Xers had the ideas of rebelliousness and nonconformity sold back to them pretty quickly as fashion statements. The 90s was the decade eventually when terms like alternative music or independent film became consumer buzzwords. Another problem that happens when a cultural moment becomes defined on a mass scale is it tends to start taking itself too seriously. Generation X was hit particularly hard by this because what were the defining characteristics of that cultural epoch before it was self-aware and before it was commercialized? Well, from the beginning, Generation X was characterized by cynicism, but it was also defined by a sense of alienation, and those feelings did inspire some really compelling art. Generation X placed a lot of importance on emotional authenticity, in deliberate contrast to the polish and artifice of 80s pop culture. A few years later, this obsession with emotional authenticity would degenerate into a contrived kind of reflexive negativity, a self-serious pseudo-nihilism, which seems especially indulgent in hindsight, considering the relative peacefulness and prosperity of the 90s. But what I appreciate most about Gen X culture, and particularly early Gen X culture before the media gassed them up into obnoxious levels of self-awareness, was that unlike the kind of snarky and sarcastic humor we associate with the 90s overall, early Gen X humor was actually pretty silly. Before the national spotlight was on Generation X as a generation, I think their lack of self-awareness allowed them to embrace the absurd and to be a bit absurd themselves. They weren't taking themselves too seriously yet. I would describe early Gen X humor as irreverent humor as opposed to ironic humor. Ironic humor has the pretense of being detached from everything and being too cool for the room, but absurdity doesn't have an ego. And in the case of both old Gen Xers and old millennials, that striving for absurdity unfortunately devolved into try-hard edginess later on, which is a big reason why so many of them have trolls remorse now, and why they're going to spend the rest of their lives being sanctimonious about offensive humor. Because it's not that they've had an actual change of heart, it's just that shocking humor isn't hip anymore. And don't get me wrong, as a precocious millennial, my sense of humor was mostly defined by edgy Gen X humor, but the best of it just didn't take itself too seriously, and that sort of made it more edgy, and that was a lot easier at the beginning of the era. In terms of the historical moment when Gen X was coming into its own, there was a sense of malaise, and this is where Chuck Palahniuk's famous line from Fight Club comes from about being the middle children of history. But before Gen Xers got bogged down with unwarranted self-pity and a sense of ennui, because that was how the mainstream media told them they should feel about themselves, there was optimism about the future. Some optimism about the future anyway, at the turning of the decade. People were no longer scared of nuclear war with Russia, and that was no small thing. That alone changed everything. On the other hand, in early 1991, America also had its first totally postmodern war, the Gulf War. This was a foreign military conflict which Americans basically experienced as a TV miniseries and on 24-hour cable news networks for the first time. And that same year, there was also an unsettling new reality to the fact that this new 24-hour media cycle could make a celebrity out of a serial killer, as it did for Jeffrey Dahmer. Cable TV in general and the exploding home video market was giving society a sense of media oversaturation, which I think is why Gen Xers became so fixated on ironic parodies of retro TV aesthetics, particularly the 1950s, which they saw as the epitome of insincerity. But part of the optimism at this time was optimism about technology, too. Home computers were becoming commonplace, video games were advancing at amazing speed, and people were excited about the possibilities for artistic expression in these new digital spaces. There were new possibilities for human connections, too, thanks to something new called the World Wide Web, which launched in '89. And yet, the world wasn't even wired up yet. It was still a tactile world of meeting up face-to-face and living in the moment. A world formed entirely around human connections made in person, no thought towards maintaining a digital version of yourself because technology was still analog and disconnected. Time moved slower, and in this idleness there was freedom. There was room for discovery, for hanging out and letting things happen spontaneously, or just being able to disappear for a while. For as cynical as Gen X styled themselves to be, they were still the last generation whose mental development was pre-digital. Their worldview was more visceral and more in touch with humanity, their own and others. They were more in touch with each other and themselves than even early millennials would be a few years later. I've always thought there was something kind of beautiful and tragic about them in that way. They didn't know what they had. I got a little taste of that world as a very small child, but how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've gotten their 1,000 free hours of AOL? So, this little period of American history, this blooming of the early Gen Xers, it was a time of contradictions, and I think when it comes to artistic possibilities, it's the friction of contradictions that creates sparks. The best example of this whole early Gen X before Gen X cultural moment that I'm trying to describe, the absolute zeitgeist of it, was probably Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks also happened to take place in Washington State, which we'll be talking about very soon. But here's why it really epitomized those contradictions. It was about a gruesome serial killer investigation, but it was also about cute, quirky, small-town life. It had art film surrealism, but also soap opera glamour. It had a sense of pop cultural history and an appreciation of old-fashioned Americana, but it was also very hip and very modern in its style. Taken all together, it was a work of hyper-reality, a vision of America that embraced lightness and darkness and was clearly artificial, but also expressed genuine, heartfelt emotions. It felt more real than real, like a good cartoon. So what about the cartoon side of things? Well, first of all, I think the late 80s and early 90s might have been the most transformational time in all of American animation history, but that's too big a topic to get into right now. You can probably say the same for what was happening in American comics, and that is what we're going to get into a little. The key feature of the rapid changes in both American animation and comics at that time was that for the first time in decades, since before the Comics Code Authority cut the entire comics industry off at its legs, it looked like adult audiences, or at least young adult audiences, were finally starting to consider the idea that comics could be a legitimate art form and popular entertainment for adults. At the vanguard of this sentiment were Gen Xers, who had made a success of the revisionist superhero comics, The Dark Knight Returns, and Watchmen a few years earlier. In response to this success, Marvel and especially DC Comics made moves towards allowing more sophisticated comics, which they hoped would appeal to teens and young adults instead of just their reliable audience of children and adolescents. And critically, this wasn't just superhero stuff either. The next big success DC had in this endeavor was hiring a young Neil Gaiman to create his own original series, Sandman, in 1989. Sandman became so popular it was the flagship title of DC's adults-only imprint label, Vertigo Comics, which launched a few years later in '93. Also, in 1989, like I mentioned, you had the phenomenal success of Tim Burton's Batman, which, and I know this is hard to imagine today in our post-superhero movie present, but Batman '89 did get more people interested in reading comics because Warner Brothers' publicity department made sure to emphasize how this movie was inspired by the more sophisticated Batman comics which had been coming out, like Dark Knight Returns. Now, on the alternative side of comics, or underground, or indie, or whatever you want to call anything that wasn't Marvel and DC, the big two, this was also an exciting and transformational period. The 1980s had seen the rise of comic book stores where, thanks to a new distribution model called direct market publishing, you could actually find smaller press comics because it's not like you were going to find the latest from Robert Crumb on the magazine rack at your local 7-Eleven right next to Spider-Man and Archie. So smaller press comics, and specifically comics for young adults that weren't just superhero stuff, those were starting to find their audience. And one of the key small press publishers of that decade was Fantagraphics. For most of the 80s, they had been based out of Los Angeles, and their flagship title was Love and Rockets. This was, and still is, an anthology series produced by the Hernandez brothers, whose stories focused mainly around one cast of characters in a Central American village and another cast of Latino characters in LA. These stories from Love and Rockets started being published as trade paperbacks, or graphic novels, if you will, as early as 1985, right around the time that DC was collecting and republishing Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen as graphic novels. And graphic novel may have just been a cheesy marketing term, but it did get comics into the hands of people who wouldn't have read them otherwise, because by packaging these comics like real books and getting them onto the shelves of legitimate bookstores, they did reach new readers who, understandably, might have been a little skittish about venturing into their local comic book store and rubbing shoulders with the Eltingville Club. So in 1989, Fantagraphics relocated their company up the coast to a city that wasn't too crowded, where the rents were cheaper than LA, and where there was still an amenable youth culture. That city, of course, was Seattle. And unbeknownst to Fantagraphics, Seattle just happened to be on the cusp of national attention as the epicenter of the grunge music scene, which would become synonymous with Generation X. And the more media attention Generation X got, the more attention grunge music got, and vice versa. And this was thanks in part to the shrewd marketing of Seattle-based record label Sub Pop Records, who promoted the term grunge as a new genre of rock music, also calling it the Seattle Sound. There was this one band called Nirvana you might have heard about. People like to wear their smiley face logo as a retro t-shirt thing now. They were the breakout mainstream success of that whole scene when their album Nevermind came out in the fall of '91. The lyrical content of grunge music was, as Wikipedia puts it, typically angst-filled and introspective, often addressing themes such as social alienation, self-doubt, abuse, neglect, betrayal, addiction, and psychological trauma. Obviously, that doesn't reflect the sense of cultural optimism at this time, which I've been trying to make a case for, but it did reflect a new openness in mainstream pop culture towards expressions of more raw emotions about sensitive subjects. Authenticity as a concept in popular art and popular culture really was king among Gen Xers. The word poser was a serious epithet. Anyways, 1989 continued to be a year of great importance in comics because the same year that Fantagraphics moved to Seattle, they also began publishing a new series by a young cartoonist named Peter Bagge, who was originally from the East Coast but had also recently moved to Seattle himself. Bagge had been working for Robert Crumb as the editor of his anthology magazine Weirdo, while also drawing his own humor anthology title for Fantagraphics called Neat Stuff. Bagge's work up to this point in his career was comparable to early Crumb, a highly cartoony art style contrasted with adult humor that ranged from being clever and satirical to just being laugh-out-loud stupid. The closest modern comparison would be Johnny Ryan, who's definitely a direct descendant of Bagge. Bagge himself cited underground cartoonists of the 60s, like Crumb of course, as an influence on his humor, but for visual inspiration, he also looked to Bob Clampett, the Looney Tunes director, and Harvey Kurtzman, the cartoonist who created Mad Magazine. One of the strips in Neat Stuff was The Bradleys, which, as the title implies, was a series about a family located in the suburbs of New Jersey who were always at each other's throats. Before the last issue of Neat Stuff, you could tell that Bagge was rapidly evolving towards more sophisticated work. Thanks in part to having Crumb as his boss and his mentor, he was learning a lot about how to tell longer, more personal stories. And amazingly, he was learning to do this without compromising his cartooning. Instead of drawing in a less cartoony style when doing stories that were more based in reality, you could see him starting to wield his cartooniness like a scalpel, knowing when to exaggerate and by exactly how much in order to make the acting between his characters more compelling. You could tell he was becoming more observant of real people's body language and their facial expressions, and incorporating that into his characters' acting. He was also developing a better ear for dialogue in his characterizations. All of this was emerging especially in the Bradleys strips, where the focus had gradually shifted from the family's humorous bickerings onto the teenage son character, Buddy Bradley. The stories about Buddy were becoming more involved and more personal because they were loosely based on Bagge's own experiences growing up. By the time he drew his final issue of Neat Stuff, Bagge was starting to enter the prime of his abilities as a cartoonist and a storyteller. The last issue, in fact, is just one long Buddy Bradley story. Naturally, he and Fantagraphics agreed that Buddy Bradley had the most potential for a new series. So, in the most unwittingly fortuitous decision of Bagge's career, he relocated Buddy, like himself and Fantagraphics, to Seattle. One initial title for this new series about Buddy Bradley was Love and Hate, but of course Fantagraphics told him that sounded too much like Love and Rockets. He also considered Hey Buddy, but was afraid that sounded too much like a children's comic. So ultimately, he decided on a title that would clearly indicate this was not a comic for kids, one which sounded a bit more aggressive, a bit more Gen X.
Buddy Bradley, a character in a comic book called Hate, speaks for an entire generation of American malcontents.
Well, Hate Comics mainly revolves around a character named Buddy Bradley. He has a negative slant on everything, and and for that reason is very reluctant to commit himself to anything. A character like Buddy and people who identify with him, what they love is pretty much defined by what they hate, and vice versa.
We're not trying to be friendly. We just want money and fame. We're the X generation. We just like to complain. Hey, hey, we're the Grunge Dreams.